So when I graduated from Gonzaga, my servant leadership was my dominant philosophy of leadership, and I did presentations and trainings and everything else around servant leadership. I published on servant leadership. Servant leadership was my focus. And then I was invited to go down to Cusco, Peru. And in Cusco, Peru, I was invited to give a conference, a half-day workshop on the concept of servant leadership. And you'll notice in the picture some of the individuals who participated in that workshop and helped me to carry out the workshop. Well, in this workshop, I presented on servant leadership and everything went great. And afterwards, everybody was happy and they came up to me. And one individual came up to me and said, "Hey, Jeff, I really appreciate this. This was wonderful. You must have the best leaders there in the United States." And while that was a compliment, it was empty for me because I realized that I had done something that I never intended to do. I had presented servant leadership as a descriptive model of how leadership is done, and it isn't. See, servant leadership, according to Robert Greenleaf and to many who espouse and teach and train in servant leadership, is an idealistic prescriptive model. It is a description of what leadership would be like at its absolute best. And those who espouse and teach servant leadership will tell you that they do not believe that they ever arrive at servant leadership, that they ever become the perfect servant leader, because we don't. We strive for it. And it's in the striving that we become better and closer to an ideal, but an ideal that we will never fully achieve. Now that makes sense if everybody understands that that is what we're looking at. But when I presented it that day, it came across as something that actually exists in its fullness, in abundance in my country and not theirs. And so I had engaged in what we might call cultural imperialism. Or colonialism. I had imposed an idealistic prescriptive model on another culture as if it was a descriptive model of how things are actually being done. And I realized that that approach wasn't going to work for me. And I had many other opportunities to teach in international contexts in Germany and Ecuador and again in Peru and many different contexts. And so I realized I needed to teach leadership a little differently. I needed to approach it differently. So I kind of stepped away from servant leadership for a while. And what I started to ask myself is, okay, what is leadership? What really is leadership that is consistent across all cultures? And what I realized, first of all, is that leadership is a momentary phenomenon. And in fact, it was my time in Peru that helped me to kind of bring some of that understanding to the forefront of my mind. Going back to Mintzberg's original work, he looked at what managers did on a daily basis and found that they engaged in a variety of different tasks, including tasks that involved influencing others, but that most of those were relatively brief. So I want you to think about that for a moment. What are your leadership moments where you're either the leader or the follower? What do they look like? Right? How often do you actually find yourself interacting either directly or indirectly with your leader in your place of work or whatever context you experience leadership? And I think if you think about it, you'll realize that many of those moments are relatively brief. If it's a meeting, it may be a full hour. If it's a one-on-one interaction, it may only be a few minutes. So leadership is a momentary phenomenon, and in each of those moments we create the kind of leader that we're going to become. So leadership then is like a chain. We build it moment by moment, and the kind of leader that we are is a result of the type of leadership that we bring to each of those individual moments. But if we stop and we look at those moments, we will find that there is an anatomy to every leadership moment. There are some basic elements that exist in every leadership moment. First of all, they take place within a context over a period of time, a specified period of time. And that context shapes the moment, whether that context is the organization that we're in, the culture that we're in, whatever it is, the context shapes the moment. Now, within that context and that time, there will always be a leader and a follower. You cannot lead if you don't have someone to follow. You cannot follow if you don't have someone leading. And so those two elements are in dynamic relationship to one another. So between the leader and the follower, there is a relationship. Now the leader is the one who is going to influence, and therefore the one who has a goal for what they want to accomplish through a process of influence. And so every leadership moment has these critical elements. A leader with a goal who has developed a relationship with a follower, and that relationship can either facilitate the influence process or get in the way of it. If we like the leader, we're more likely to be influenced by their process. If we dislike the leader, that's going to impact how well we are influenced by their process. And all of that happens within a context and over a certain period of time. So every leadership moment has that basic anatomy. Think about your own leadership moments, and I'm sure you'll see that. Now, having said that then, a leader and a follower both bring to that moment their way of being, thinking, and acting. If I am the leader, I step into that moment with my way of being, my character, my attitude, my emotional state, my mood, those things that kind of underpin who I am, including my motive, right? So I bring that way of being, and others respond to that way of being. If I come to the leadership moment with kindness and openness, I invite that from the other. Now, followers, of course, do the same thing. They bring a way of being to every leadership moment that invites a response from the leader and others as well. So our way of being. We also have a way of thinking. Our way of thinking is our philosophy of what it means to lead and to follow. And that philosophy ultimately shapes the way that we act. If we believe that leadership is just about carrots and sticks, rewards and punishment, then the only thing that we will ever do as a leader is offer rewards or punishment for compliance. Our way of thinking shapes our way of acting, and they all are influenced by our way of being and influence our way of being. And so as a leader, we come to these moments with a way of being, thinking, and acting. As followers, we do as well. And that is really critical to realize. Now, having said that, then, I realize that leadership is a momentary phenomenon and it has a basic anatomy. But is there anything universal about the process? So I began researching and looking at what happens in these leadership moments, and what I realized is that leaders and followers come into these moments using their brains, right? All leadership, all followership is conducted through the processes of the human brain. Now, what research tells us about the way the brain works is this, that the content of the mind is culture dependent, right? What we view as important and how we think about certain things and the values that we have are all shaped by our culture. But the processes of the mind, the basic functional processes of the brain are driven by human anatomy, and they are universal. Consider for the moment the following example. So we step into a leadership moment. Let's say it's a leader interacting with a follower one-on-one. The leader approaches the follower and becomes aware of what's going on in the moment. They are aware of the follower, they're aware of themselves, they're aware of their goal, they're thinking about their processes, awareness, right? And as the brain draws in that information, it determines where to focus attention. What are the priorities? What are the things that I need to say and do in order to influence the follower? That involves decision making and then ultimately action on the part of the leader. Now the follower also becomes aware of the leader as they come, but they're also aware of what's going on in their current environment and all of that, and that awareness is both conscious and subconscious. And out of all of that information that's available to the brain determines where to focus attention. And so it begins to focus attention on the leader as they approach. And the follower then directs that attention towards the leader as they listen to what they have to say, receive the influence process, and then the follower makes decisions about how they will act based on that leadership influence. Now, that's what's going on inside each of their brains as they're interacting, but the key to that interaction is that they have to communicate. The leader has to communicate to the follower has to receive that communication and respond. And between the leader and follower is that constant existence of a relationship which is characterized by the emotional connection between them in any given moment. And so in every single leadership moment, whether it's one-on-one, in a meeting, whatever the context may be, in every single leadership moment, there are basically 6 core leadership principles and practices that if we can strengthen our ability to engage in those, they help us to be effective as a leader. Awareness, attention, decision-making, communication, relationships, and action. Now, there are also specific moments that require different skills and competencies. So leadership happens at the self level as I influence myself, right? And motivate myself. Things like managing time, mindfulness, stress management, centering. These are all skills that are needed to be effective at the self level. At the interpersonal level, I need one-on-one social skills. The ability to listen to and interact with and engage and influence an individual one-on-one. At the group level, I need group facilitation skills, the ability to engage with a group and shape that group's behavior and decisions and help them to accomplish goals. And then, of course, at the organizational level, when we're leading across groups and multiple groups, that requires a different set of skills. And finally, at the societal level, when we're being outside of organizational context, that requires a different set of skills. And so our way of acting as a leader has elements that exist in every moment. We might call those fundamental skills of leadership. And then we have skills and competencies that we need to practice in specific moments. And so this is the way that I came to think about leadership as a momentary phenomenon to which leaders bring their way of being, thinking, and acting to engage those fundamental and contextual skills of the leader. And then I was doing a research study on an individual by the name of Leonidas Proaño. Now, Proaño was a Nobel Peace Prize nominee from Ecuador, and he was significant in the land reforms and educational reforms that really empowered a lot of the indigenous community in Ecuador to transform itself. And he did this in a very unique way. And so what I wanted to do was study his speeches and his writings and understand his philosophy and approach to leadership. But what was really powerful was that as I did this, I heard Greenleaf. I heard so many things that Greenleaf was talking about in the U.S. context coming out of this individual who was deeply involved in the Latin American context and had no connection to Robert Greenleaf whatsoever. They both had been influenced by Paulo Freire, but aside from that, very different contexts, very different experiences. But here was an individual in Latin America practicing an approach to leadership that really reflected a lot of the elements of Greenleaf's servant leadership, but in a culturally responsive way. And that made me realize that there are elements of servant leadership that are also universal. In particular, the motive to serve. Greenleaf himself believed that when somebody is inspired by the motive to serve, that it influences, shapes their behavior, but not always in a predictable way. That servant leaders may have very different, authentic approaches to leading others. And I think that's what we see when we look at this situation, that Greenleaf in his context saw one way and Proaño in his context saw another way. So then what we do is we wed these two ideas, and I've begun to wed these two ideas. The idea of leadership as happening in a moment, and leaders bring their way of being, thinking, and acting to servant leadership, where that way of being, thinking, and acting is the way of the servant leader. and in following the way of the servant follower. And that is what this class is about. That is what we are going to explore as we move forward in this course, and I look forward to doing it with you.